What if a country, a major global power, found itself in a perfect storm? I mean, an unpopular leader, massive social unrest, a far-right gaining ground, and really concerning finances, all hitting at the same time. How would it even begin to navigate that? Especially when its own history makes compromise, well, really difficult. Welcome to this deep dive. We're going to unpack the complex, sort of interconnected crises facing the French Republic right now. Our source material, it's an expert analysis called France at a Crossroads: Crisis, Legitimacy, and the Future, and it really takes us beyond the headlines, gets into the deep-seated issues shaping France's path forward. Our mission here basically is to understand the layers of this instability. We're talking everything from its very ingrained cultural history of protest to the real legal battles affecting its political future, and of course the economic pressures challenging its place in Europe.
Yeah, and a crucial point the report makes is that it's not just a list of separate problems. It really digs into how these things are intertwined, feeding off each other, creating this really volatile mix. We'll be looking at how different sides see these events, like how a specific legal move, perfectly constitutional on paper, can be seen by, well, most people as pretty authoritarian.
Right.
Or how a court verdict against, a major political figure can be framed as both justice being done and a kind of political trap to sideline the opposition. We need to explore those nuances, give you the full picture so you can weigh things up yourself.
Exactly. So as we get into this, we'll be asking, what's really driving French protest? I mean, beyond this specific policy issue of the day, how does a president who seems constitutionally powerful end up fueling such a deep crisis of legitimacy that governing becomes almost impossible? And when a country faces serious debt, why might an IMF bailout be completely off the table? Which forces us to look at other solutions with their own, baggage. Let's unpack all of this. Okay, so to really get why a policy change in France can just, explode, we have to understand what makes the French, French, when it comes to disagreement. Because for them, a strike isn't just stopping work. It's almost like a national tradition, a historical right, maybe their most powerful tool. So let's dig into these deep roots of French discontent. How did the strike become such an iconic, almost defining thing? What's the core idea? It's more than just economics, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's fundamental. You have to grasp that in France, the strike isn't just a tactic for better pay or conditions. It's seen as a profound cultural and political act. It's deeply rooted in that revolutionary spirit of 1789, seen almost as an extension of French identity, this legacy of citizens rising up against what they see as injustice. This isn't new. It's a legacy built over centuries of collective action, creating this powerful collective memory of successful popular movements. And to really get it, you need to look at a key legal moment: the law of March 21st, 1884. This wasn't just some minor legal update. It actually abolished a really restrictive law from 1791, the Le Chapelier law.
The Chapelier, what did that do?
Well, the Chapelier law came out of the early revolution, and it basically outlawed any kind of professional association, guilds, collective bargaining, strikes. It wanted just individuals and the state, no groups in between challenging authority. So when the 1884 law came along and scrapped it, it was massive. It explicitly legalized the right to organize and, crucially, the right to strike. It transformed striking from something illegal done in secret into a recognized, legitimate, you could almost say sacred way for ordinary people to demand change and hold power accountable.
Wow, okay, so it went from illegal defiance to a basic legal right. That's a huge change in how citizens relate to the state. But did that translate into real power straight away, or did unions still have to fight to make that right actually mean something?
Well, it wasn't instantaneous, but the legal change definitely opened the door. Early unions, especially groups like the Confédération Générale du Travail, the CGT, they quickly saw the power in this newly legal weapon. The strike became their main tool. And over time, unions gained more power, representing whole industries, moving from just disruption towards negotiation, actively participating in shaping working conditions, pay, social laws. And you can really see this power in action at key historical moments. Take the 1936 Popular Front government. Before they came in, there were widespread strikes, workers occupying factories, millions involved, this huge wave of unrest. And those actions led directly to landmark reforms that completely changed French society.
Like what, specifically?
We're talking about the 40-hour work week, the right to paid holidays, things we now take for granted, but they were revolutionary then. And they were won directly because of that collective action, that pressure from the strikes.
Yeah.
They weren't just given, they were fought for and won, right there on the streets and in the factories.
Those are massive foundational changes. And 1968, of course, that's another huge one, still talked about globally. How did that fit into this tradition?
Exactly. May 68. The general strike involved millions of workers, students basically paralyzing the whole country for weeks. Imagine it. Trains stopped, factories silent, universities occupied, even the national TV news was interrupted by striking staff. It was an unbelievable display of collective power. The government, under de Gaulle, was seriously shaken.
And the result?
The result was the Grenelle agreements. Significant wage increases like 10% on average, but a massive 35% hike in the minimum wage. Plus, more social reforms, stronger union rights. These were tangible victories won through huge public pressure. And this created this powerful kind of self-reinforcing cycle. It cemented this collective belief that disruptive action, that striking, works in France. It forces the government and employers to concede. So this history, these successes, they deeply shape expectations today. People think, well, it worked then, why not now?
That deep belief in collective power really brings us to today. The 2023 pension reform protests were a massive story everywhere, weren't they? A real modern example of this historical spirit. What was the trigger exactly, and how did those protests show that legacy?
The trigger, the immediate catalyst, was the government's plan to raise the legal retirement age from 62 to 64. Simple as that on the surface. But it instantly set off this historic wave of opposition, probably the biggest in decades. On just one day, January 19th, 2023, estimates were over 1.1 million people protesting nationwide. And crucially, all 8 of France's biggest unions joined forces in strike actions.
Wow, all 8 together. That's rare, isn't it?
Very rare. And it wasn't just one day. The demonstrations, often involving many more people than those initial estimates, went on for months. Huge disruption. It really underscored this deep public anger. We saw that scale and intensity again, proving that this cultural weapon is still very much alive and kicking.
And it wasn't just the numbers, or even just those 2 extra years, was it? The analysis suggests a deeper feeling of unfairness, like the government was breaking some kind of fundamental social promise.
That's absolutely key. For the opponents, it went way beyond just adding 2 years. Let's think about this idea of the social contract being eroded. For many French people, it felt like a betrayal. France, prides itself on this strong welfare state, this idea the state looks after you, cradle to grave. Pensions aren't just a spreadsheet calculation. They feel like a solemn promise.
A promise that if you work hard.
Exactly. If you work hard, often in tough, physically demanding jobs, the state guarantees a dignified retirement. So forcing people to work longer, especially those in physically demanding jobs, think construction workers, nurses, factory workers, it felt like the government was just tearing up that promise, prioritizing abstract budget numbers over people's actual well-being.
Yeah, I can see that.
Imagine starting work at 18, maybe doing something physically exhausting for decades. You've always been told retirement's at 62. Then suddenly it's, nope, 2 more years. Maybe if you sit at a desk, okay, it's annoying. But if your body's already worn out, it's not just 2 years. It feels like a deep injustice, a betrayal of your life's work. And for women, often with broken career paths or starting earlier, it often felt even more unfair. It's this gut feeling of being devalued, that the system isn't there for you anymore. So the protests quickly became about more than pensions. It was a broader critique of the government's priorities, its perceived disconnect from ordinary working people. Opinion polls showed this consistently.
When people talk about French strikes, sometimes you hear these, well, almost caricatures. Like, I remember hearing something about public sector workers striking because they couldn't have wine at lunchtime. Can we address those kinds of stories? Do they distract from the real issues?
Oh, absolutely. It's important to push back against those caricatures because they often trivialize very real, deeply felt concerns. This idea of a big strike over lunchtime wine, it's a massive exaggeration of a very specific, tiny incident. It doesn't reflect the big picture at all.
What was the real story there, then?
The sources indicate it was mainly a publicized threat to strike by some French riot police back in 2011. They were upset about a new rule forbidding wine or beer with lunch. It made headlines, became a bit of a joke, an easy target for critics, sure, but it was not a widespread national strike, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the major systemic issues driving things like the pension protests. These anecdotes are just noise, really. They distract from the real serious concerns about the French social contract.
Okay, so a distraction from the deeper issues. What was the core grievance in 2023 then, beyond the pension age itself? We cut through the noise.
The core grievance became this perceived erosion of the social contract, coupled with a profound crisis of democratic legitimacy. And this is where it gets really critical, kind of the linchpin for everything that followed. The government's decision to force the pension reform through using Article 49.3 of the Constitution. They did this despite overwhelming public opposition.
Article 49.3. That's the one that lets them bypass a vote.
Exactly. It's a constitutional tool, but using it felt deeply symbolic here. Imagine you've got 70%, maybe even 90% of the public against this reform that's almost unheard of rejection, and the government uses a procedural loophole to avoid a vote in parliament. To millions of people, it just screamed, "We don't care what you think." Yeah. And that fundamentally changed the nature of the opposition. It stopped being just about pension policy. It became a rejection of the government's whole approach to democracy, its perceived authoritarian streak. The lack of dialogue, government just digging its heels in, it fueled so much anger, even radicalization. It reinforced this view of an illegitimate government and, critically, made any future reforms much, much harder. It shows how the process can become just as important, maybe more important, than the policy itself, especially in a country like France with such a strong attachment to the idea of popular will.
And that anger over Article 49.3, it didn't just appear out of nowhere, did it? It landed on ground already prepared by years of public unhappiness with a leader many already saw as out of touch.
So let's focus on President Macron now. He's at the center of this storm. Why does he keep getting hit with that president of the rich label? Where does that persistent unpopularity come from, and how has it really shaped his time in office? Yeah, that's a key point in the analysis. Macron's presidency has been consistently dogged by this crisis of popularity, almost from day one, really. His approval ratings have nearly always been historically low for a French president, often below 30%, sometimes even dipping under 20% in some polls. Those are levels that would finish most leaders. And this widespread dissatisfaction, it's largely seen as stemming from a mix of his economic policies and his distinct governing style, which often comes across as quite aloof.
And the president of the rich thing.
Right. That label isn't just political spin from his opponents. It's a perception that's become deeply embedded, and it's reinforced by a few things. His background in investment banking at Rothschild and Company, even before politics, already made some on the left suspicious. But it was really his first-term fiscal reforms that cemented the image.
Which ones specifically?
Well, things like significantly lowering the corporate tax rate from 33% down to 25%, and creating a flat tax on capital gains, which reduced taxes on financial assets. Now, the idea was to boost investment, attract business, but for a huge chunk of the population, it looked like these changes overwhelmingly benefited wealthy individuals and big companies, while the working and middle classes didn't see much gain, or even felt squeezed. This perception really set the stage for hostility towards later reforms, like the pensions. It made it incredibly hard for him to build trust or consensus.
So his background in those early policies created this image, which then made later reforms instantly suspect, instantly controversial. It's like perception became the political reality. And that Article 49.3 move on the pension reform, that really poured fuel on the fire, didn't it? What's the tension there? It's legal, but people saw it as deeply anti-democratic.
Absolutely. The political crisis really hit boiling point with that 2023 pension bill because Macron's government, in his second term, didn't have a reliable majority in the National Assembly. They couldn't guarantee they'd win a vote. So they took the politically risky and, as it turned out, incredibly damaging step of invoking Article 49.3.
Remind us again exactly how that works.
It lets the government push a bill through Parliament without a vote. It just passes unless MPs immediately pass a motion of no confidence against the government, which is hard to do. Now, here's the crucial point, the real source of the controversy. Using 49.3 is perfectly legal. It's written right there in the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, designed to give the executive power. But, and this is a big but, it was almost universally perceived as anti-democratic, even authoritarian by most French people.
Even by people who voted for him.
Yes, including many of his own voters. It wasn't about the letter of the law, it was about the spirit of democracy. Using it completely shattered the already very fragile talks between the government and the powerful French unions. They'd basically said, "We'll keep protesting until you withdraw the bill." And remember, public opposition was sky-high, 70% to 90% against the reform. Using 49.3 just confirmed people's worst fears about the government ignoring them. It turned a policy fight into a deep crisis of trust in democratic institutions. For many, it felt like the government was overriding Parliament, overriding the people's will.
It really sounds like a cascade of political missteps leading to this cycle of alienation, like a self-defeating spiral, almost a trap he set for himself. You explain that idea a bit more, this self-defeating spiral of democratic erosion.
Yeah, looking at the bigger picture, Macron's strategy, which is driven by his desire to push through reforms he believes are vital for France, seems to have unintentionally created exactly that, a self-defeating spiral. Because he lacks a stable majority, his reliance on bypassing Parliament with tools like Article 49.3, which he sees as necessary, consistently alienates potential allies across the political spectrum. Nobody wants to be associated with forcing through unpopular measures.
So it makes finding partners harder.
Much harder, and it just cements his image as this out-of-touch, maybe even undemocratic leader, especially among working and middle-class voters. This makes actually governing incredibly difficult because he struggles to build any kind of cross-party agreement. So what happens? His government ends up having to use similar strong-arm tactics for other laws too, creating this worrying pattern of governing by decree or constitutional loophole.
Which people obviously resent.
Exactly. It's seen by many as a real degradation of democratic norms. His government's actions have even been described using this term, undemophobie, basically, an allergy to the people, to popular opinion. And this profoundly damages trust in democratic institutions, which then feeds into something else some analysts call a vibe session.
Vibe session, what's that?
It's this idea of an economic downturn driven not just by hard data, but by the mood, the vibe, a general lack of confidence and optimism fueled by social and political unrest. People just feel worse off, less secure because of the political climate, regardless of what the GDP figures say.
So it's a feedback loop. He can't get consensus, so he uses forceful methods. People hate the methods. Trust collapses further, making consensus even less likely next time. And all the while, the populist opposition gets stronger.
That's it, precisely. They can then very credibly point and say, look, the system is rigged. The government doesn't care about you. It widens the divisions even further. It's a really fascinating and worrying example of how a government, even when technically acting within the law, can end up undermining its own legitimacy and the very democratic process it's supposed to uphold.
It's a vicious cycle. Lack of trust leads to methods that destroy more trust, leading to more anger, deeper divisions, making any kind of national unity incredibly hard to achieve.
Exactly. A very precarious situation. #3, the rise in legal quandary of the national rally.
So if the mainstream government is caught in this downward spiral, seen as less and less legitimate by so many people, who benefits? Who fills that space? And that brings us squarely to the dramatic rise of the national rally, led by Marine Le Pen. How on earth did this party go from being seen as, a fringe group, almost untouchable, to becoming the main opposition force in France? It's a huge shift in the political landscape.
It is a huge shift, and the analysis points to a very deliberate and, frankly, highly effective transformation of the National Rally, or RN. They consciously moved from that political fringe, historically burdened by extremist views, to become the dominant opposition. How? Through this carefully managed detoxification strategy.
Detoxification, meaning what exactly?
Meaning systematically trying to shed the party's historical baggage, the associations with xenophobia, anti-Semitism that were deeply linked to its past as the National Front, founded by Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen. There were some very bold, symbolic moves.
Like kicking out her own father.
Exactly. The very public expulsion of Jean-Marie Le Pen back in 2015 was a major signal. And then in 2018, renaming the party from National Front to National Rally. These weren't just cosmetic changes. They were strategic moves aimed squarely at appealing to a wider, more mainstream audience, especially working-class voters who felt abandoned by the traditional left and right parties. They tried hard to shed that pariah status, cultivating an image of a party that cared about ordinary French people, focusing more on economic protectionism and national sovereignty, even if the anti-immigrant stance remained core. They wanted to look like a credible alternative, not just a place for protest votes.
And their platform seems to have really connected with a large and growing part of the population, hasn't it? What are the core policies that have struck such a chord, and how has that translated into actual votes, into electoral success?
Their platform is this potent mix, really.
Yeah.
Economic nationalism combined with very strong anti-immigration policies. It's a complete counterpoint to Macron's liberal pro-EU approach. Economically, they champion protectionism over free trade, France first, basically. Prioritizing French jobs, French industries. They're strongly against globalization, against privatizing public services like healthcare or social security. They want the state to play a bigger role in the economy, promising to cut the cost of living, support French businesses.
And on immigration.
On immigration, they're calling for a moratorium on legal immigration, a big cut in foreign arrivals, even pulling out of the Schengen area so France can control its own borders again. They push this idea of national preference, meaning French citizens should get priority for jobs, housing, social benefits over foreigners. This whole package really resonates with people who feel left behind by Macron's reforms, those worried about national identity, people skeptical of the EU and its impact on French sovereignty.
And the results speak for themselves.
Undeniably. Their success has been rapid and significant. In 2022, they became the single largest opposition party in the National Assembly, winning an unprecedented 89 seats. That's up from just 8 seats in 2017, a massive jump. And then, in the 2024 European Parliament elections, they scored a landslide victory, pulling in 31.4% of the vote. That's nearly double what Macron's party got. It clearly signals a major, maybe even permanent shift in French politics.
So they're on the rise, they're popular. Marine Le Pen looks like a serious presidential contender. And then, boom,
Yeah.
this major legal twist, this conviction has huge implications. Is this the justice system doing its job, or is it, as some are framing it, a judicial trap to take out a political rival?
That's the million-euro question, isn't it? And it's where politics and the legal system collide in this very dramatic, very controversial way. So on March 21st, 2025, Marine Le Pen and 25 other National Rally figures were convicted by a Paris court for misappropriation of public funds.
What were they actually accused of doing?
The core allegation was that the party illegally used money from the European Parliament funds, meant specifically for paying parliamentary aides and their work-related expenses, to instead pay its own party staff back in France. People working for the RN party, not directly for the MEPs in Brussels or Strasbourg. And the court specifically found that Le Pen herself played a central role in setting up and managing the system. It wasn't just that she didn't notice. The ruling implies direct involvement. This whole investigation had been dragging on for years, actually, started back in 2015. So it wasn't sudden, but the verdict landing when it did was explosive.
And the sentence, what were the immediate consequences, especially with the 2027 presidential election not that far off?
But the sentence itself was pretty heavy. 4 years in prison, but 2 of those suspended. The other 2 years to be served under house arrest with an electronic tag, plus a $100,000 euro fine. But the real bombshell, the part with massive, immediate political fallout, was the 5-year ban from holding public office.
5 years. Wow.
Exactly. And here's the really contentious part. The court added an exceptional order of provisional enforcement, specifically for that ban. That means the ban on holding office takes effect immediately right now, even though Le Pen is obviously planning to appeal, and appeals can take years.
So that effectively takes her out of the 2027 presidential race.
Pretty much. The ban would still be active. For someone who's been the runner-up in the last 2 presidential elections, whose party is polling incredibly well, this is just a monumental earthquake. It completely reshapes the future of French politics. It leaves a massive question mark over the National Rally's leadership and totally changes the potential field for the next presidential election.
That is huge. It really throws the whole political game up in the air, essentially removing a top contender, at least for 2027. What does this do to how people see the justice system itself, especially her supporters?
And that's exactly where this idea of a judicial trap really gains traction, and it becomes incredibly divisive. For many of Le Pen's supporters, and probably others too, the timing and especially that immediate enforcement of the ban, it just looks suspicious. It feeds the perception that the legal system is being used as a political tool.
Like the establishment couldn't beat her at the ballot box, so they used the courts?
That's the narrative, yes. That the system found another way. Critics might argue, well, would similar allegations against other parties have been pursued so hard or resulted in such an immediate career-ending provisional ban? Now, whether that's fair or not, legally speaking, the perception is powerful. This action, regardless of the legal merits, definitely reinforces that populist storyline. The system is rigged. State institutions are weaponized against the people's choice. It could seriously deepen distrust in institutions like the judiciary, especially among those who already feel alienated.
But could it backfire? Could it actually help her party?
That's the counter-argument, absolutely. While it stops Le Pen running next time, it could actually energize her base. It positions the RN as victims, martyrs even, fighting against a biased system. It could galvanize support. So it's this incredibly complex tangle of legal accountability versus political legitimacy in a country that's already deeply polarized.
So for you listening, how do we make sense of this? A really high-stakes legal decision seen so differently, either as vital justice holding power accountable or as a political weapon. What does that do to public faith in the institutions themselves? How do you even begin to sort that out? And what does it mean for the long-term health of French democracy?
It's certainly a critical question with no easy answers. Okay, we've covered the deep social unrest, the crisis of political legitimacy. Now we need to add that third crucial element, France's finances. You really can't understand the current turmoil without looking hard at its, well, deteriorating fiscal position. What are the key numbers telling us? What's the state of the French economy, and how does it look compared to the rest of Europe? Yeah, the fiscal health is definitely a major and growing worry, putting France on what feels like a very precarious tightrope. Looking at the figures from the end of 2024, the public debt hit 113.0% of GDP. That's up noticeably from 109.8% the year before, so it's heading in the wrong direction.
And the deficit.
Yeah.
That's the yearly shortfall, right?
Exactly, and that's perhaps even more alarming, especially for France's partners in Europe. The public deficit ballooned to 5.8% of GDP. Now, the EU has strict rules, the Stability and Growth Pact, which sets a limit of 3%, so 5.8% is way over. In cash terms, that deficit was a huge, 169.6 billion. And again, the trend is consistently upwards. It was 4.7% in 2022, 5.4% in 2023, now 5.8%. Those numbers are definitely worrying, especially that deficit figure being so far above the EU limit. What's actually driving all this spending? Are there specific areas really pushing up the deficit? You can see a few key drivers pretty clearly. Social benefits are a huge part of it. They accounted for something like 60% of the increase in public spending in 2024. That jump was mainly down to two things. First, indexing benefits to high inflation, meaning payouts had to rise just to keep pace with prices. And second, a big 5.3% increase in basic pensions that kicked in right at the start of 2024. That shows a commitment to protecting retirees' spending power, but it comes at a very high cost.
Okay, so social spending is a big factor. What else?
Well, the general running costs of the government, operating expenditures, they rose by 3.8%. And maybe the most significant factor recently is the sharp rebound in interest payments on the national debt. They jumped by a notable 14.6%. After years of super low interest rates, central banks have hiked rates to fight inflation. That means the cost of servicing France's already large debt, plus any new borrowing, has suddenly got much more expensive. It's eating up a bigger slice of the budget very quickly.
Right, rising interest rates hitting hard. So how does France stack up against other big economies, the G7 nations? Is it way out on a limb with its debt, or are others in a similar boat? And what's the real worry here? Is it the total debt pile or something else?
It's useful to put it in context, and it highlights where the real concern lies. Looking at the total debt pile, France's debt to GDP ratio, projected around 116% for 2025, is high, yes, but it's actually not an outlier compared to many other major developed countries. Japan, for instance, is way higher, like 235%. Italy's around 137%. France is actually lower than those, and only a bit higher than the US at 122%, or Canada at 112.5%. It's above the UK's 104% and way above fiscally conservative Germany at around 65%. So on sheer debt level, France is sort of in the middle of the G7 pack.
Okay, so the total debt isn't the unique problem. What is then?
The real red flag, the thing that worries markets, and especially France's Eurozone partners much more, is the chronic deficit. The fact that year after year, spending significantly outstrips revenue. That 5.8% deficit in 2024, that is now actually worse than countries like Greece, Italy, and Spain, the very nations that were at the center of the Eurozone crisis back in 2008 and needed bailouts.
Wow, worse than Greece and Italy now.
Yes. And that comparison is alarming because it suggests a fundamental ongoing inability to get spending under control within the existing revenue streams. It signals a lack of fiscal discipline that makes investors nervous. You can see this anxiety reflected in the bond markets. The yield, or interest rate, on French government bonds has been widening compared to German bonds. Investors are essentially demanding a higher price to lend money to France, signaling they see increased risk and less confidence in its financial path.
So it's not just numbers on a page. It connects right back to the political crisis, the legitimacy issues we were talking about. How exactly does this fiscal challenge feed into the political turmoil and the social unrest?
They're completely intertwined. It creates this really problematic feedback loop. The government tries to fix the finances with austerity, with reforms like the pension changes, spending cuts. But these attempts are met with massive public opposition, huge protests, social unrest, as we've seen. Why? Partly because people distrust the government's motives, thanks to that legitimacy crisis.
And the political instability makes fixing things harder.
Exactly. The fact that Macron has a minority government, the months of budget delays, the political stalemates, it makes it almost impossible to pass meaningful, potentially painful fiscal measures through normal parliamentary channels. Every attempt just becomes another flashpoint for protest. So this creates the loop. The inability to act decisively because of political opposition makes the fiscal situation worse, which then requires even more painful, politically toxic reforms down the line, which fuels even more public anger, reinforces the view of an illegitimate government using force, makes the next round of reforms even harder, and strengthens the populist opposition who offers seemingly easier answers.
So the question becomes, can a government actually implement necessary but unpopular economic measures if it doesn't have public trust? Especially when the public has this long history of successfully resisting top-down changes.
That's the fundamental challenge. It highlights this deep tension in democratic governance when trust has broken down so severely. How do you manage necessary fiscal adjustments in that environment?
Okay, so we have significant debt, a persistent deficit way over EU limits, growing market jitters. The word bailout starts floating around. And often people immediately think of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Let's tackle that. What exactly does the IMF do? What's its role when a country hits serious financial trouble?
Right. Most people know the IMF as the world's sort of financial emergency service. It's the lender of last resort for countries facing severe balance of payments problems, basically, when they can't pay their international bills. It's an international institution, and its main goal is to keep the global monetary system stable by giving financial help and policy advice to prevent or fix financial crises.
And that help comes with strings attached, right?
Absolutely. It's not free money. IMF financial support almost always comes with what's called policy conditionality. This means the country borrowing the money has to agree to undertake specific structural reforms and austerity measures. Things like cutting public spending, raising taxes, maybe selling off state-owned companies. The idea is to fix the underlying economic problems that caused the crisis in the first place, not just provide a temporary cash fix, and importantly, ensure the country can eventually repay the loan.
Okay, that's the standard IMS playbook. But for France, a G7 nation, a founder or major shareholder of the IMF itself calling them in would be, well, more than just asking for help, wouldn't it? It would signal a kind of global failure. So why is an IMF bailout for France seen as so improbable, almost unthinkable, despite its fiscal problems?
That's a really crucial distinction the analysis makes. France holds this unique position. It's not just a member. It's a founding member, a major creditor to the IMF. It has one of the biggest voting shares. The Banque de France, its central bank, is deeply involved in G7 meetings, manages relations with the IMF directly. The whole global financial setup assumes that a G7 economy, a powerhouse like France, can manage its own crises. An IMF bailout for France wouldn't just be a national humiliation. It would be seen as a systemic failure of global economic governance. It would suggest the big established powers are fundamentally unstable, which would really shake international confidence.
So it's politically almost impossible.
Pretty much. Which means when you hear French politicians talking about a potential IMF bailout, it's often best understood as rhetoric, a kind of political theater. They might use the threat of the IMF to justify unpopular austerity measures at home. We have to make these cuts or the IMF will force us. It's a way to try and deflect blame onto an external force. But realistically, even the IMF's own assessment, their staff country report on France, found its financial sector was resilient despite the challenges. They noted France has a deep, stable market for its government debt. That doesn't sound like a country needing emergency IMF intervention from the IMF's own perspective.
Okay, so if the IMF is basically off the table because of France's status and what it would mean globally, what are the real safety nets? If France did face a truly severe crisis, where would it realistically turn? Within Europe, presumably. And what would that involve?
Exactly. The plausible backstops are firmly within the Eurozone's own structures, mechanisms created specifically after past crises to handle these situations internally. The main one is the European Stability Mechanism, the ESM.
The ESM, what's up?
It was set up in 2012 as a permanent firewall, specifically to help Eurozone countries in deep financial trouble or facing risks that could spread. The ESM acts as the Eurozone's own lender of last resort. It raises money by selling bonds on the market and then uses that money to provide loans or other assistance to member states in crisis. It has a pretty hefty lending capacity, maximum of $500 billion. But critically, just like the IMF, getting help from the ESM comes with strict conditions.
So still strings attached.
Oh, yes. Countries receiving ESM aid have to implement significant structural reforms, fiscal adjustments, often austerity measures. And this is all under intense supervision from the ESM itself and the European Commission. It's essentially answering to your European partners. The goal is the same.
Yeah.
Restore long-term fiscal health, fix the root causes.
Okay, so the ESM is like a Eurozone-specific IMF, providing conditional loans. What about the European Central Bank, the ECB? What role would it play?
The European Central Bank, ECB, plays a huge, though often less direct role in keeping the whole Eurozone stable. Its main job is setting monetary policy, controlling inflation, protecting the euro's value. But in a crisis, the ECB has powerful tools to contain debt problems, calm markets, and keep borrowing costs manageable for member countries. Think of things like its big asset purchase programs essentially buying government bonds to inject liquidity and keep rates down. And more recently, it created an anti-fragmentation tool, specifically to stop borrowing costs diverging too much between different Eurozone countries.
And its power is?
Theoretically unlimited through its monetary policy tools. Unlike the ESM's fixed pot of money, the ECB can create money. This makes it a very formidable backstop. Now, the ECB doesn't impose direct fiscal conditions like the ESM or IMF do, but its actions indirectly impose discipline. Its willingness to support a country's bonds in the market depends partly on that country making credible efforts to fix its finances. If a country keeps running huge deficits, the ECB might eventually step back, which would send borrowing costs soaring and force the government's hand.
So it's a more indirect pressure, but still powerful.
There has been criticism, though, right, that the ECB sometimes enables countries to avoid reforms.
Yes, that's been a recurring criticism that by keeping borrowing costs artificially low for struggling countries, the ECB sometimes reduces the pressure on them to make difficult but necessary fiscal reforms. It can allow them to sort of kick the can down the road. But ultimately, the ECB remains the most immediate and powerful line of defense for France within the Eurozone framework. Okay, so we're talking about a very different set of players and rules compared to a global IMF intervention. Could you just quickly summarize the key differences between these institutions, IMF, ESM, ECB, and how they relate to France?
Sure, let's break it down simply. IMF, global, 191 members, huge lending capacity, $1 trillion, always involves strict policy conditions, austerity reforms. For France, a bailout would be a sign of global systemic failure, a massive blow to its standing. ESM, Eurozone only, 19 members, fixed lending capacity, $500 billion, provides loans with strict conditions, overseen by European partners. France would be answering directly to its neighbors. ECB, Eurozone only, 20 Euro countries, theoretically unlimited capacity via monetary policy, acts mainly to stabilize markets, keep borrowing costs down, doesn't impose direct loan conditions, but exerts powerful indirect pressure for fiscal responsibility. Its actions would be the first line of defense to calm markets for France.
Right, so the fact that an IMF bailout is so unlikely really shifts the whole dynamic. It's not about whether help is available somewhere in the world. It's about the internal political blockage in France, this inability to address its own fiscal problems through its own democratic processes because of the deep divisions and lack of trust. So the critical question for you, listening, becomes, if France did need help from its Eurozone partners, from the ESM or ECB, what kind of conditions would they impose? And how on earth would the French political system, with its history of protest, its current legitimacy crisis, cope with the inevitable public backlash against austerity or reforms seen as dictated from Brussels or Frankfurt? That feels like a potential national reckoning just waiting to happen. Hashtag outro. So we've really dug into these deep, turbulent currents flowing through France today. We've seen how historical protest culture fuels a modern crisis of government legitimacy. We've looked at a surging populist movement facing potentially game-changing legal challenges.
And we've examined significant fiscal problems that, while serious, probably won't trigger an IMF call, but could well involve France's European neighbors. It's a really complex, almost tangled picture, isn't it? As France tries to figure out how to reconcile this deeply divided population with an economy struggling under debt, maybe the ultimate question for you to think about isn't if change is coming, but how a nation can possibly unite behind any shared vision for the future when its core institutions, the presidency, the courts, maybe even parliament itself, are viewed with such deep skepticism by so many.
Yeah, and that raises a really important question that goes way beyond just France. What happens when the path forward for any country really requires consensus, requires making tough choices together, but the very system you have for doing that seems to be actively undermining trust and deepening the divisions at every turn? It's a fundamental challenge to how modern democratic governance is supposed to work.